Amen. So tonight, I'm here to talk to you about parakeets. Yeah, parakeets. Yeah, parakeets. My wife wouldn't let me buy a dog. Okay, someone was going to give us a dog actually, and she wouldn't let me have the dog. So I had to find an angle, and most of you know we take care of Sophia, and Sophia loves birdies, and Sophia, anything I can do to make Sophia happy, I do. So it kind of was a twofer, go out and get a parakeet and make Sophia happy. I have somebody to hang out with while I'm up early in the morning or late at night, and somebody to talk to, and it seemed like a real good idea. So we went to the pet store, and this young kid, I guess, well, I don't even know if they're young anymore. They all look like they're young now. They all, I mean, he could have been 30, and that's young to me now. Um, Oh, really? Okay. Um, well, he seemed to know what he was talking about. So I started asking him, should we get two right now or should we get one? So he came off like he knew exactly what he was talking about. So I said, get one now, get that one used to you, because if you get two, they're going to bond together. And then it's going to take you a lot longer to get them to like you because you're you, and then to bond with the kid. And I said, okay, I believe you. So we got one, and took him home. Had a little trouble assembling the cage. Kind of fell apart a little bit. But needless to say, we got the bird in the cage, and the bird just sat there. And he was like so pathetic. I mean, he had been chirping and singing, and he was having a great old time at the store. But he's sitting in the house, he's just like looking so sad and really like, oh, it was horrible. So, Ruby, who usually is against spending money needlessly, suggested that we get another one right away. So I said, okay, we'll go get another one right away. And, needless to say, that made Sophia really happy. She really liked to see the two birds. And what's interesting, though, is that when the two birds were in there, after they started eyeing each other, because I think we got a boy and a girl now, but they're eyeing each other like, who are you? You look familiar, because they were just in the same cage together at the store. They both started moving around, and they're still not singing yet, but they're active, and they seem more content. And I started thinking about that. We're kind of like that. I think there are times where we can feel really alone. I think that's probably one of the worst feelings, and some people aren't subject to that. But at some point, I think everybody feels alone. You feel it, and sometimes it's in the middle of the night, or if you're going through something, circumstances, somebody lets you down, and sometimes it's that lonely feeling where we can't even sense God's presence. And a lot of times we'll reach out to people, and there's nothing wrong with that. We should reach out to people. That's what we talk about a lot in the men's group, is reaching out to one another, being there for one another, having the ability to have confidence that we can lean on each other, we have each other's backs. Kind of like when David had those guys that were following him, and at first they were his ragtag band of men. They were disillusioned, all of the D's that were describing them. But after they were together for a while under David's influence, they were mighty men. So that's what we're trying to do in our men's study. And so I'm not against that. I think there is a lot of value in putting our burdens with each other, and counseling and so forth. But in First Peter, Peter says that, he says, yes, all of you be submissive to one another and be clothed with humility, for God resists the proud, but gives grace to the humble. And then he goes on, he says, therefore humble yourselves under the mighty hand of God, that he may exalt you in due time, casting all your care upon him, for he cares for you. And that's the difference. A lot of times if we can find somebody who wants to listen to us, they may really care. Okay, they may really care about what we're doing or what we're going through. And they may care about it to the point where they want to help, but a lot of times they can't. See, the great thing about God is he not only cares about what you're going through, but he can do something about it. And when we're with people, and when people come to us, that's where we should be directing them, is to God. Because that's basically the only hope that we have in this life, to deal with whatever problems come. We live in a fallen world. More and more, this culture is becoming more aggressively hostile towards Christianity. If you're out in the world, if you watch any television, if you read, if on the internet, you see how basically they're trying to marginalize Christians as illiterate hillbillies, basically. We don't know anything. We read a book that's based on legend and all these things. And the society, the culture is getting really hostile towards Christians. And so what do we do? How do we, what do we do when we're feeling alone, when we feel anxious about our circumstances, when we really feel like there's nobody there that understands us? And we start to feel the pressures of life pushing in on us. And I think we've all been there. You're at work or you're at home, and it's almost like Job, one thing after another, one thing after another. You start feeling the pressure, and it's not very comfortable. So what do we do? Well, let's look at Psalm 139. So if you want to turn to Psalm 139, we're going to look at that. And we're going to look at David as he examines two things that are very comforting in the life of a Christian. God's omnipresence. He's everywhere present at all times. And his omniscience. God knows everything. Now, if you're a Christian, that's very comforting because God knows everything about you. He knows everything about you. He's got plans for you. He's got your back. He's just all over it. Now, if you're a non-Christian, if you're a non-believer, that's probably not as good news to hear because he knows everything they do as well. And he knows exactly what they're up to. He knows the motives of their hearts. And we'll look at that a little bit. But let's read a couple of verses. We're going to read verses 1 through 6, and then we're going to talk about that. Psalm 139, starting in verse 1. He says, this is David, "O Lord, you have searched me and known me. You know my sitting down and my rising up. You understand my thought afar off. You comprehend my path and my lying down, and are acquainted with all my ways. For there is not a word on my tongue, but behold, O Lord, you know it altogether. You have hedged me in behind and before. You have laid your hand upon me. Such knowledge is too wonderful for me. It is high. I cannot attain it." So David is talking about, God's omniscience. And he starts off and he says that, you have searched me and known me. It's like he realizes that God has scrutinized him, that God has looked at him, just like he does at all of us. And he's studied us, and he knows him. It's a very intimate term where he says, and you've known me. God knows us intimately. And the great thing is that he still loves us. You think about that. How we are. We all have our private lives, our thought lives, and everything in our pre-Christian days. And God knows all that. And yet he still loves us. David goes on in verse 2. He says, "You know my sitting down and my rising up. You understand my thought afar off." He knows what you're going to be thinking before you even think it. He just knows us in and out. He knows our sitting down and our rising up. That talks about our daily activity. He knows all of it. He's intimately aware with everything we do, everything we think. Now, when he talks about everything we think, that also includes like the motives of what we do. God knows those. You can't fool him. He goes on and he says, "You comprehend my path and my laying down and are acquainted with all my ways." So he's really going into that thing, that God knows everything about him. "For there is not a word on my tongue, but behold, you know it altogether." God knows what we're going to say before we say it. And it's just, amazing, that God, the creator of the universe, who knows this about us, it's comforting to us because he's not surprised by anything we do, even when we blow it, even when we don't say the right thing, or we're not salt and light as we should be, or when we just make a foolish decision, or we're not good representatives of his kingdom. He knows it. It doesn't excuse it, but he knows it. And he's still there. He still loves us. He says, you have hedged me in behind me and before me and laid your hand upon me. Now, I love that picture because it's almost like, to me, I see God as a shield, before him. He's hedging him in. He's standing before him, before David, as a shield. But he's also behind him, and he has his back. And then he's laying his hand on him. He's letting him know that he's there. He's putting he's like putting his almost a seal of approval on him. It's like when someone comes up from behind you. Have you ever had that? Someone comes up from behind you and they know you're having a bad day maybe, and they put their hand on your shoulder and they just kind of let you know that they're there for you. And that's how I see that God is doing that. He's this hedge of protection around David and around us. And David has to, he has to expound and say, such knowledge is too wonderful for me. It's too high. I cannot attain it. Basically saying, it blows my mind. God is blowing David's mind. There's a passage in Romans 11. You don't have to turn there, but I'm going to turn there real quick. And Paul kind of deals with this. And he says in Romans 11, verse 33, oh, the depths of the riches, both of the wisdom and knowledge of God. How unsearchable are his judgments and his ways past finding out. Paul was getting his mind blown away too. He was thinking about what God has done. And he says, how unsearchable are his judgments and his ways past finding out. For who has known the mind of the Lord? Or who has become his counselor? Or who has first given to him? And it shall be repaid to him. For of him and through him and to him are all things, to whom be glory forever. Amen. So you want to get your mind blown? Contemplate about God, and it will. I mean, it does. Verse 7. Read a couple more verses. Where can I go from your spirit? Where can I flee from your presence? If I ascend into heaven, you are there. If I make my bed in Sheol, behold, you are there. If I take the wings of the morning and dwell in the uttermost parts of the sea, even there your hand shall lead me, and your right hand shall hold me. If I say, surely the darkness shall fall on me, even the night shall be light about me. Indeed, the darkness shall not hide from you, but the night shines as the day. The darkness and the light are both alike to you. God, again, he sees everything. He's there. He's everywhere present at one time. It's almost like David is saying that if I was to flee from you, where could I go? He can't go down to Sheol. If he was to go and start running from the sun rises in the east and sets in the west. So if he was to start running from the east and all the way to the west, God would still be there. God would be there if he was in the sea. He says, even there your hand shall lead me, your right hand shall hold me. If I say, surely the darkness shall follow me, even the night shall be light about me. Even darkness can't keep God from seeing what's happening in our lives. When we don't know or we can't sense him, he's still there. He's still there. He's still there for us. Verse 13. For you formed my inward parts. You covered me in my mother's womb. I will praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Marvelous are your works, and that my soul knows very well. My frame was not hidden from you. When I was made in secret and skillfully wrought in the lowest parts of the earth, your eyes saw my substance being yet unformed. And in your book they all were written, the days fashioned for me, when as yet there were none of them. He's talking about when David was conceived. When God formed him in the womb, God was intricately involved. And there's different theories on what happens when does the soul come into existence? Does God create a whole new person at that point, or is it something genetic? And we're not going to go there, but what's interesting though is that God is aware of David. He's aware of us when we were being conceived, even as fetuses, that he was aware of David as a human being. From the moment of conception, we believe that babies are humans. Fetuses, zygotes, they're human lives, and because of that, they're created in the image of God, and they deserve the right to live. And it's when I was first a Christian, I didn't know that, because you learn a lot of things as you read, as you walk with the Lord. But we also bring a lot of things into the church that we learn out in the world, in school, from our friends. And the truth is, in here, this is where we get truth from. Jesus said that he came to testify of the truth, that he was the way, the truth, and the life. And, Saturday we were looking at the guys on the resurrection. Truth is of utmost importance. Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15 that if Christ did not raise from the dead, if it's not a historical event, then we're wasting our time. If Christ didn't rise from the dead, nobody rises from the dead. We're going to die in our sins. It's futile, it's vain. And we know that it really happened, that it's true. It's not just a hope so that, pie in the sky kind of thing. Jesus was a historical person, and he's a real person, and we've all experienced him. And we can depend on him and trust him for truth. And David goes on and he talks about, how I will praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. He's just, again, getting his mind blown for how God has created us. You think about that. What would we do if we had to think about, breathing or our hearts beating? We would die. We would forget to do it probably. But God has created us in such a wonderful, marvelous way that, we don't even have to worry about that. And God was watching David even from that time. Not only does God infinitely aware of what is going on in our lives now, but God was aware of us before we were even conceived. And through that whole process, God cares about each of us deeply. He's concerned about us. He says, your eyes, in verse 16, saw my substance being yet unformed. He wasn't even formed. That may be a reference to an embryo, but am I still on? Okay. But he saw him, and he saw him as David. He didn't see him as a mass of tissue or a blob. He saw him as David. And then he goes on and he says, and in your book they were all written, the days fashioned for me, when as yet there were none of them. God had a plan for David's life. He has a plan for our lives. And he has, it's like he knows, he has a will for us. And he knows about us. And he's always known about us. And he cares. Verse 17, how precious also are your thoughts to me, O Lord, O God. How great is the sum of them. If I should count them, they would be more in number than the sand. When I awake, I am still with you. I think he's realizing that, hey, God thinks about us so much, and it's evidence of this love that he has for us. Think back, I think back, I still, with my wife, when you're dating and you go home and you call the person you just saw like 15 minutes ago and you stay on the phone for like 2 hours, And with me, it was like, I'm very gregarious, so I'm doing all the talking. And she's, I'm having to check with her. Are you still there? Are you still awake? But that feeling of intimacy, that you just have to be around that person. And David's realizing that God is like that, feels like that towards him. That even when he's asleep and he doesn't really have a cognizance or a consciousness of God's presence, when he wakes up, God's still there. He hasn't abandoned him. Don't really know what the historical, grammatical background or context of this psalm is. It's interesting because it doesn't really fit any of the genres very, very neatly. So it's almost like this was just David just sharing his heart. He didn't really design it in a way that it just maps out to the rest of the Psalms. A lot of the Psalms, they have poetic values. They have a lot of parallelisms and so forth. There's a couple in here, or they're what's called a max. There's a mixal, I think it is, and that's basically a teaching psalm. We're going to see there's a little bit of an imprecatory prayer in here, but it's just like David just laying it all out there, and just crying to the Lord. So whatever the situation was, he was basically going over in his mind, that I can count on this God. This God is here for me. He knows me, and he still loves me. He says in verse 19, "Oh, that you would slay the wicked, O God." This is the imprecatory part. This is a little difficult, okay? Imprecatory prayers seem to be at odds with New Testament theology, like love your neighbor and love your enemy and things like that. Well, let's read. Let's go through this. "Oh, that you would slay the wicked, O God. Depart from me, therefore, you bloodthirsty men, for they speak against you wickedly." He's David saying that they're bloodthirsty men. They have no regard for human life, for decency. They're wicked people, and he's asking God to kill them. It seems like, right? To slay them. For they speak against you wickedly. Your enemies take your name in vain. Do I not hate them, O Lord, who hate you? And do I not loathe those who rise up against you? Has anybody ever heard somebody misrepresent God and you feel that your spiritual blood is boiling? And kind of a righteous indignation? I know that when I was a younger Christian, I used to do a lot of studying on the cults, because it seemed like all of my family members and friends were in cults or something. And so you start to read what these people believe, especially some of their what we call Christologies, their theology about Christ. And as a Christian, you know that Christ, who is God, he laid down the prerogatives of his deity, and he became a servant in order to give up his life as a ransom for us. He didn't have to die. There was no reason for him to die other than because he loved us. And as Christians, we really, when we understand that, when we have that appreciation for what Christ has done for us, when he died for us just because he loved us, you get an appreciation for that. And when you hear people saying that, well, he was really the half-brother of Lucifer, or he was an angel, or he was just some guy, or whatever the case may be, it used to make my blood boil, honestly. Sometimes even looking at some Christian television, excuse me, I had to say that, makes my blood boil, because they misrepresent God. They make it seem like God is poor, and that God has to, if poor God, if you don't send in your money, God's going to lose this TV program or something. It's crazy. And yet that makes my spiritual blood boil. I don't hate these people, but, well, maybe I do. But anyway, but the sense is that, that David is upset. He's outraged. The good thing, though, that he does here, verse 19, he says, "Oh, that you would slay the wicked, O God." The principle is that he was allowing God and asking God to judge them. Okay, he wasn't going to go. It's like with Saul. He had opportunities to kill Saul, and yet he allowed God to do that. Excuse me. And he goes on, he says, verse 20, "For they speak against you wickedly. Your enemies take your name in vain." See, he's not saying that it's because of what they've done to him, although they're probably chasing him. But he's putting it in the sense of what they have done to God, that they're God's enemies, and he's against God's enemies. "Do I not hate them, O Lord, who hate you? And do I not loathe those who rise up against you?" He says, "I hate them with perfect hatred," complete hatred. "I count them my enemies." So we see David, back in 19, he says, "Slay the wicked, O God." He's asking God to do it, to judge them. Now we're going to see something really interesting here in 23 and 24, and we'll be closing shortly. Hopefully you guys will enjoy going home a little earlier tonight. 23, "Search me, O God, and know my heart. Try me and know my anxieties." See, he's asking God because that you know what? Yeah, I hate these people. I want you to judge them. But he's doing something really important here. And this is something we have to do too. Because again, as Christians, sometimes we are too busy thinking of all the things that we're against, and standing up against this and that and the other thing, which we should do. But sometimes we forget why. And we have to look at our motives, because God does. But he says, "Search me, O God, and know my heart. Try me and know my anxieties." He's asking God to make sure that his motives are okay. In this hatred, in this blood-boiling condition that he's in, where he's outraged by these people, he's saying, "Search me, O God, and know my heart. Try me and know my anxieties, and see if there is any wicked way in me." Am I justified in hating these people, or hating this wickedness? "And lead me in the way everlasting." See if there's any wicked way in me, and lead me in the way everlasting. Basically, he's saying, if I'm wrong, God, show me I'm wrong. Reveal it to my heart. And help me to be like you and not like them. And I never saw that before. It was pretty interesting when I saw that this last time. I thought it was just kind of tacked on there. But in the context, it's like, wow, I didn't know David was, he's very contemplative, but I just didn't see that. Excuse me. So in closing, some things to think about. Whatever evil circumstance, person, whatever that's in your life or comes in or out of our lives that would thwart the plans of God in our life, or just when you feel like everyone's abandoned you, remember that God is always near to you. Even when it doesn't feel like it, he's there. Because you will have that moment when you wake up and you realize that he's still there. You can take comfort in that. When I was a new believer, some of you probably have had similar experiences as a new believer. Probably within a few months after receiving the Lord, I started hanging out with my old friends, the wicked people. And little by little, just going back into the world, had one foot in and one foot out. And when you come to that realization that God is still with you and watching you in this behavior, you have to make a decision. Unfortunately, in my case, I made the wrong decision. And that's what happens in some cases. Some people, instead of just repenting and go, "Okay, Lord, I gotta get my act together. I trust you." There are some of us who are foolish enough to say, "You know what? I can't handle this, but I can't clean up my act, and I don't know enough to know that you're going to be the one to do it, not me anyway," and you take off. And sometimes that happens when people hear a teaching, or they have some sort of an encounter with God. It's kind of like the same sun that melts the wax, hardens the clay. If these facts can do different things for different people. In my case, back then, it really pushed me away from God, and it was my fault, my own undoing, and I added a lot to my own hurt. But it's interesting, though, again, to me, that it's very powerful. When you realize that God's with you, that He's involved in your life, whether it causes a person to kind of step away and say, I can't commit, I can't surrender, or it causes them to wholeheartedly embrace it. The power of the gospel, the power of God's working, the Holy Spirit, you're either going to quench it, or you're going to do something to squelch it, or you're going to allow it to empower you to do things that you could never do before. And that's kind of a whole other study. I have a kind of a weird theology on backsliding and so forth. But anyway, we can trust Him. He made us. He has plans for us. He understands us. He knows what we're thinking. He knows what we're thinking. He knows what we're going to get into. He even knows the motives of what we say and do. So recognizing that we can't fool Him, but sometimes we can fool ourselves. So the best thing is to live transparently. Sorry, Mike. Transparently before Him, and to be like David, to see, to be willing to examine ourselves and allow God to reveal our hearts to ourselves, and to see if there's any wicked way in us, but to hold on, to grasp onto Him, and to follow Him as He leads us in the way everlasting.